The Lost Books of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden. Publication date 1963. We found this book in the public domain, public access, so no copyright infringement was intentional, and we've brought it to all in video format for educational purposes alone. Below this is a description of what the book is all about. It's in English, and it's presented here as 2 volumes of apocryphal writings reflecting the life and times of the Old and New Testaments. Stories told by contemporary fiction writers of historical Bible times in fascinating and beautiful style. The Gospel of the Birth of Mary, Protevangelion, the first Gospel of the infancy of Jesus Christ. We're actually looking for the Book of Nicodemus, or the Acts of Pilate. We're not sure if it's in here, but anyway, we're going to have a look at this particular book. We're going to expand it so you can read along on your screen. The Lost Books of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden. The World Publishing Company, New York. It doesn't specify one author in particular. The Lost Books of the Bible, being all the Gospels, epistles, and other pieces now extant attributed in the first 4 centuries to Jesus Christ, his apostles, and their companions, not included by its compilers in the authorized New Testament, and the recently discovered Syriac manuscripts of Pilate's letters to Tiberius, etc., translated from the original tongues, illustrated from ancient paintings and missals. Christ was a joyous boy of the fields. We are not permitted to think that the shadows of Calvary darkened his pathway as a youth, and the apocryphal books of the New Testament show a great deal of the early life of Christ, not to be found in the 4 evangelists. Dr. Talmark. List of illustrations. Introduction to the Lost Books of the Bible by Dr. Frank Crane. The great things in this world are gross. This applies to books as well as to institutions. The great things in this world are gross. This applies to books as well as to institutions. The Bible is a growth. Many people do not understand that it is not a book written by a single person, but it is a library of several books which are composed by various people in various countries. It is interesting to know how this library grew and upon what principles some books were accepted and some rejected. Of course, we may take people's word for the reasons why certain books were chosen, but it is always satisfactory to come to our own conclusions by examining our own evidence. This is what this Lost Books of the Bible enables us to do. We can examine the books of the Scriptures which have in the authorized version, and then in this book we can read those Scriptures which have been eliminated by various councils in order to make up our standard Bible. It is safe to say that a comparison of the accepted books with those rejected may be relied upon, for those books which were accepted are far superior in the value to the others. These others, which are included in the Lost Books of the Bible, comprise all kinds of stories, tales and myths. No great figure appears in history without myths growing up about him. Every great personage becomes a nucleus or centre about which folks' tales cluster. There are apocryphal tales about Napoleon, about Charlemagne, about Julius Caesar, and other outstanding characters. It is impossible that a man representing so great a force as Jesus of Nazareth should appear in the world without finding many echoes of his personality in contemporary literature. Many stories which grew up about him as time elapsed, or time passed. What these tales and stories are, just how he appears to the fictional minds of his day, and afterwards it is interesting to note. Very often the fiction writer depicts life and the great truth of life better than the historian. He does not pretend to write down what is exactly true, but he tinges all things with his imagination. His feelings, however, may be just and reliable. The reading of this lost books of the Bible is interesting as a matter of course. All who in any way are attracted by the personage of Jesus are interested to know any stories that may have grown up about him. They are also valuable because they enable us to get many a point of view which otherwise would have been lost. History may be true, but in a sense tradition is even truer. It has been said that history records what has been, but tradition tells what ought to have been. It must be remembered also that such a thing as historical accuracy is a comparatively novel product. The older writers never dreamed of it. They wrote in order to be interesting, not to tell the truth. And it is a remarkable fact that the events recorded in the Holy Scriptures, as far as we can find out, were most of them veritable, and the chroniclers were truthful. In this volume, all these apocryphal volumes are presented without argument or commentation. The reader's own judgment and common sense are applied to. It makes no difference whether he is Catholic or Protestant or Hebrew. The facts are plainly laid before him. These facts for a long time have been the peculiar esoteric property of the learned. They were available only in the original Greek and Latin and so forth. Now they have been translated and brought in plain English before the eyes of every reader. The ordinary man has therefore the privilege of seeing upon what grounds the commonly accepted scriptures rest. He can examine the pile of evidence and do his own sifting. Thousands of people today look to the New Testament narrative as the leader and guide. It is important to know upon what authority this rests, and many a man will be delighted to find the evidence thus clearly presented before him. The lost books of the Bible present all sorts of matter before the curious eye. There are stories about Mary and instances of her personal life. There are other stories about the boyhood of Jesus and instances about his crucifixion. All of these become important because of the central figure about whom they revolve, or they're centered around, or they reveal. No man has ever appealed to the imagination of the world and so played upon its feelings as has Jesus of Nazareth. It is interesting to know what forms of stories and speculations about him took place in the early period of the Christian era. In other words, the ordinary man is invited to take his place in that council chamber which accepts and rejects the various writings of Scripture. It is safe to say that the conclusion desired can safely be left to his common sense. It can no longer be said that our Scriptures were accepted by learned men. You do not know that, but you must accept their conclusions. Now it is shown you upon what grounds these conclusions rest. As a believer in the authenticity of our accepted Scriptures, the person presenting this here, the author, perhaps, had no hesitancy in saying that he was perfectly satisfied to let the common sense of the world decide upon the superiority of the accepted text. The publication of this book would do good because it takes away the veil of secrecy that has hidden for many years the act of the Church in accepting certain scriptures and rejecting others. All of the grounds are rendered perfectly intelligible to the common man. The order of all the books of the lost books of the Bible with their proper names and numbers and chapters. Okay, so we're really looking for the book of Nicodemus. Here it is, 22. The Acts of Nicodemus, hopefully. Supposedly said to be the Acts of Pilate. Okay, got a bit too far forward. Okay, it's just the actual books of Nicodemus. Doesn't look like it. I'm going to go back to find that particular page. We're sure it said 22. Okay, to go skim through it. This is chapter 22. That's books of the Bible. Mary. Gospel of Thomas, early infancy. Here we go, Nicodemus. Oops. Where does it start? Here we go. The Gospel of Nicodemus, formerly called the Acts of Pontius Pilate. Although this Gospel is by some among the learned, supposes to have been really written by Nicodemus, who became a disciple of Jesus Christ and conversed with him. Others conjecture that it was a forgery towards the close of the 3rd century by some zealous believer who, observing that there had been appeals made by the Christians of the former age to the Acts of Pilate, but that such acts could not be produced, imagined it would be of service to Christianity to fabricate and publish this gospel, as it would both confirm the Christians under persecution and convince the heathens of the truth of the Christian religion. The Reverend Jeremiah Jones says that such pious frauds were very common among Christians, even in the first 3 centuries, and that a forgery of this nature with the view above mentioned seems natural and probable. The same author, in noticing that Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical history, charges the pagans with having forged and published a book called the Acts of Pilate, takes occasion to observe that the internal evidence of this gospel shows it was not the work of any heathen, but that if in the latter end of the 3rd century we find it in use among Christians, as it was then certainly in some churches, and about the same time find a forgery of the heathens under the same title, it seems exceedingly probable that some Christians at the time should publish such a piece as this, in order partly to confront the spurious one of the pagans, and partly to support those appeals which had been made by former Christians to the Acts of Pilate. And Mr. Jones says he thinks so, more particularly as we have innumerable instances of forgeries by the faithful in the primitive ages, grounded on less plausible reasons. Whether it be canonical or not, it is of very great antiquity or age, and is appealed to by several of the ancient Christians. The present translation is made from the Gospel published by Irenaeus in the Orthodoxographer, Volume 1, Tom 2, page, it must be Tome, page 64-3. 643. The Gospel of Nicodemus, the disciple, concerning the sufferings and resurrection of our Master and Saviour Jesus Christ. Chapter 1. 1. Christ accused by Pilate by the Jews of healing on the Sabbath, summoned before Pilate by a messenger who does honour him, worshipped by the standards, bowing down to him. That's the eagle banners, right? The Roman standard that they bore, right, when they went to battle, or they went marching. They had this eagle icon, or this golden pole, or this pole, whatever. That when he, in his presence, they bent towards him, those standards. Annas and Caiaphas and Simas and Datum, Gamaliel, Judas, Levi, Nephilim, Alexander, Cyrus, and other Jews went to Pilate about Jesus, accusing him with many bad crimes. And Jesus and and said, "We are assured that Jesus is the son of Joseph, the carpenter, and born of Mary, and that he declares himself the Son of God and a King. And not only so, but attempts the dissolution of the Sabbath and the laws of our fathers," or forefathers, Moses, etc. Right? Pilate replied, "What is it which he declares, and what is it which he attempts dissolving?" The Jews told him, "We have a law which forbids doing cures on the Sabbath day, but he cures both the lame and the deaf, those afflicted with the palsy, the blind," the palsy is probably leprosy, "the blind and lepers," no, actually it's something else, "the blind and lepers and demoniacs on that day by wicked methods." Pilate replied, "How can he do this by wicked methods?" They answered, "He is a conjurer, and casts out devils by the prince of the devils, and so all things become subject to him." Then said Pilate, "Casting out devils seems not to be the work of an unclean spirit, but to proceed from the power of God." The Jews replied to Pilate, "We entreat your highness to summon him to appear before your tribunal and hear him yourself." Then Pilate called a messenger and said to him, "By what means will Christ be brought hither, or to us?" Then went the messenger forth, and knowing Christ, worshipped him, and having spread the cloak which he had in his hand upon the ground, he said, "Lord, walk upon this and go in, for the governor calls thee." When the Jews perceived what the messenger had done, they exclaimed against him to Pilate and said, "Why did you not give him a summons by a beadle?" By a beadle, and not by a messenger. Is that some sort of bird or a dog or something, or what? For the messenger, when he saw him, worshipped him, and spread the cloak which he had in his hand upon the ground before him, and said to him, "Lord, the governor calls thee." Then Pilate called the messenger and said, "Why hast thou done this? What have you done there?" The messenger replied, "When you sent me from Jerusalem to Alexander, I saw Jesus sitting in a mean figure upon a she-ass." So he was sitting on a donkey. "And the children of the Hebrews cried out, Hosanna, holding boughs of trees," or palm trees, branches, etc., in their hands. Others spread their garments in the way and said, "Save us, thou who art in heaven. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Then the Jews cried out against the messenger and said, "The children of the Hebrews made their acclamations in the Hebrew language, and how could you, who's a Greek, understand the Hebrew?" Come on, man. The messenger answered them and said, "I asked one of the Jews and said, what is this which the children do cry out in the Hebrew language?" So he didn't know the language, so he asked somebody else who could speak the Hebrew, and he replied to him, and he explained it to me. This messenger said, he told me what it meant, what they were saying. They cry out Hosanna, which being interpreted is, "O Lord, save me," or "O Lord, save." Pilate then said to them, "Why do you yourselves testify to the words spoken by the children, namely, by your silence?" And what has the messenger done amiss? Was he done wrong? And these accusers were silent. Then the governor said unto the messenger, "Go forth and endeavour by any means to bring him in." But the messenger went forth and did as before, and said, "Lord, come in, for the governor calleth thee." And as Jesus was going in by the ensigns who carried the standards, these are messengers possibly, or guards maybe, somebody who carried these standards, the Roman standards, these eagles on a pole, the bearers, right? They carried these Roman standards. The tops of their standards bowed down to worship Jesus. So these, what they were carrying, actually bent down like a tree, like bends with the wind, like they were honouring him, they were worshipping him. Whereupon the Jews exclaimed more vehemently against the ensigns. They were like, what the hell's going on, What'd you come here for, all that sort of stuff. But Pilate said to the Jews, I know it is not pleasing to you that the tops of the standards did of themselves bow and worship Jesus. Something miraculous, right? Miraculous. But why do you exclaim against the ensigns as if they had bowed down and worshipped? Because only those standards did. They replied to Pilate, we saw the ensigns themselves bowing and worshipping Jesus. Were they lying? Then the governor called the ensigns and said, he asked them, why did you do this? The ensigns said to Pilate, we are all pagans and worship the gods in temples, and how should we think anything about worshipping him? We only held the standards in their hands and they bowed themselves and worshipped them. So these Pharisees or these Jews were lying, right? They're trying to find something to pin on Jesus, right? Or pin on these ensigns. Okay. So they get into trouble as well, right? Then said Pilate to the rulers of the synagogue, these are Pharisees, do you yourselves choose some strong men and let them hold the standards? He's telling them, you get some strong men from amongst you. You get them to hold those standards. See what happens. Okay? And see whether they'll bend of themselves if your people are holding them. So the elders of the Jews sought out 12 of the most strong and able old men and made them hold the standards, and they stood in the presence of the governor. Then Pilate said to the messenger, take Jesus out and by some means bring him back in again. And Jesus and the messenger went outside, right? Outside the hall. And Pilate called the ensigns who before, these are like, I guess these are people who retrieve these people and bring them in to the hall in the presence of the emperor, right? The procurator. And Pilate called the ensigns who before were carrying those, bearing those standards, and swore to them that if they had not been bearing those standards in that manner when Jesus before entered in, he would cut off their heads. Okay. Then the governor commanded Jesus to come back in again, and the messenger did as he had done before, and very much entreated Jesus that he would go upon his cloak and walk upon it, and he did walk on it, and went inside. And when Jesus went in, the standards bowed themselves as before, right? They did it again and worshipped him. Chapter 2. And is compassioned by Pilate's wife, charged with being born in fornication, testimony to the betrothing of his parents, hatred of the Jews towards him. These Pharisees toward him. Now, when Pilate saw this, he was afraid and was about to rise from his seat, because he saw it, right, with his own eyes. He thought, what the hell? These standard banners suddenly bend over, these metal objects. They're bending over. Maybe these eagles that are on them, right? You see them on those movies. The Roman standard's got this eagle on it, which is representative of Rome. But they probably folded their wings or something and bent over, something like that. And he freaked out. And he's about to stand up. But while he thought to rise, mid-thought, right, his own wife, who stood at a distance, sent to him, saying, or she said to him, saying, maybe she sent a message, you go tell him this, have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered much concerning him in a vision this night. She had a dream. When the Jews, she was standing there, she must have told him. When the Jews heard this, they said to Pilate, do we not say unto thee, he's a conjurer, or he's a magic man, right? He's a devil, he gets all this done through the power of the spirits, these evil spirits, the devil, all that sort of stuff. Look, he's caused your wife to have a dream, okay? An instant dream, but she's talking about the night before, right? Or she had a nanny nap, whatever it was. She had this dream about Christ. Pilate then calling Jesus said, you've heard what they are saying against you? What they're testifying against you? Trying to make out it's true? What's your answer to that? You haven't made an answer to it, right? You haven't made a reply. You haven't retorted it. Jesus replied, if they had not a power of speaking, they could not have spoken. Or spoke, right? If they didn't have that power to speak, given them, they wouldn't be able to speak. But because everyone has the command of his own tongue, you have to control your own tongue, right? You have control of your own tongue. To speak both good and bad, let him look to it. Okay? Let him examine what he said, right? What come out of his mouth. But the elders of the Jews answered and said to Jesus, what shall we look to? In the first place, we know this concerning thee, that thou wast born through fornication. There they are lying again. Secondly, that upon the account of thy birth, the infants were slain in Bethlehem. Well, Herod, right, did that. So it's Herod was to blame for that. But he was the reason why Herod did it, right, as an infant. Thirdly, that thy father and mother Mary fled into Egypt. Again, another scriptural truth. Because they could not trust their own people. Well, they fled into Egypt because of Herod. Herod wanted to kill the child, Jesus, the infant.